Well, thank you all for coming and for inviting me. I think it's a very interesting topic of the conference, and it has various somewhat related, so raises various somewhat related issues. Something that I've been thinking about in relation to the topic of the conference concerns something actually very basic, sort of very basic problem that precedes, in a way, epistemologically speaking, more abstract problems that some of the other speakers will talk about. It really concerns the question whether we can have evidence in science at all. In other words, or at least in some sciences, in particular in biology. In other words, one of the ideas is, I mean, when we think normally about evidence for a theory or for a theoretical proposition, we assume somehow that we have coherent theory. And we have sort of implicit, at least, criteria of what constitutes a coherent theory. Now, the question is, I will deal with the case of biology, and maybe some analogies can be drawn with other sciences, but I'm not sure to what extent. I never really thought about that. Maybe with physics, but in physics the situation seems to be very different for many reasons. So basically the question is what constitutes a coherent theory in order to have evidence for particular theoretical statements. Now, when you think about biology, a typical sort of simplistic way of understanding biological theory is that biological theory tells us something about, you know, molecules, relations between molecules, and pretty much that's it. And it's usually, I mean, that kind of statement doesn't really mean much, but usually taken to represent a kind of a caricature version of reductionism. Now, reductionism has been dominant for quite a while in philosophy of science and even in philosophy of biology, not so much anymore over the last maybe 15 years or so. Now, the idea of the reductionist idea of how this background, sort of the criteria that determine whether an ontological structure of a theory is coherent comes in different forms. Now, in a way, I think this is one of the, just a very brief summary of one of the arguments that defend the sort of reductionist ontology in general, as a more general ontological argument, and then philosophers of biology usually draw on this argument. They think these are really, these three principles, that I'll just briefly explain, are the reason why a biological theory is coherent, or what sort of provides coherence to biological theory. So usually the presupposition, or maybe a metaphysical principle, I'm not sure, sometimes it's defended, sometimes it's presupposed. It seems to me that works more as a sort of presupposition, something that philosophers would say, with some philosophers, is intuitively sort of appealing. That mere logical reduction kills causal reduction. What does that mean? It means that if you have a biological system, its parts, if it can be reduced to more elementary parts, the causal powers of the whole, for example, cell, are reducible to more basic causal powers, which are typically instantiated in these more elementary parts. So it's a very appealing principle. And sort of the first thought is, well, how can we question this? Then relating principle is that there are certain microentities in every biological system which realize these macrocausal powers. So, for example, whatever a living cell does really can be reduced, at least in principle, to what the parts of the cell are doing. And typically, what are the parts? Well, molecules of some sort and their interactions. And then the quite well-known and much discussed argument that originates, at least in this form, from Jagmohan Kim, that was initially thought out in relation to mental properties, but then, you know, it kind of became also an argument. These were a general ontological argument. It became an argument that supports also biological sort of claims or regarding reductionism. So the idea, very briefly, is that downward causation. So when you claim that your whole or the part, your entire system somehow influences what the parts are doing, is in a way untenable in ontologically or metaphysically speaking. For a couple of different reasons, Kim develops arguments, various arguments to defend this thesis, such as overdetermination, a problem that downward causation supposedly faces, and so on. But these are the three principles that we should have in mind that constitute basically the ontological or sort of metaphysical basis of what biological theory or sort of ontological infrastructure of biological theory should look like according to some philosophy.
Could you please repeat what mereological reduction exactly is?
Just reduction of a whole into its parts. We can divide it into more elementary parts, nothing more than that. Now, of course, immediately the question is, well, you know, what kind of parts? What is the criterion of this reduction and so on? And the reductionist idea is, well, you know, there's always a more elementary level which is basically carries the causal powers, and all these causal powers of macro entities will be reducible, at least in principle, to the causal powers instantiated at these lower level entities. As I said, this is much discussed over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, so the reductionist, just very briefly, position then would be that there must be a kind of a fixed hierarchy that goes from molecular, whatever that means, level, all the way to the level of cell, tissue, organism, groups, species, and so on. Now, some examples really fit this picture. Some examples from biology, especially, for example, early understanding of the function of DNA, maybe the first 10 years after the discovery of the function of the DNA. Also, one could argue that in molecular biology we have examples where biological explanations square with this kind of ontological model. Now, as a consequence, and this is also kind of a metaphysical inference, if it is true that those three principles really provide the criteria of ontological coherence, then any anti-reductionist claim that contradicts these principles will really be incoherent. In other words, talking about downward causation can be only a sort of a helpful, vague tool to deal with very complicated systems. But really you cannot make a coherent, you cannot make an argument that downward causation is, ontologically speaking, a coherent concept. In other words, scientists will often use incoherent, metaphysically speaking, incoherent concepts as sort of helpful tools, but that's not something that in the end or in principle constitutes the ontology of nature, so to speak, that we can infer from biological theories. And some philosophers actually think, philosophers of biology, they actually, for example, Alex Rosenberg, he thinks, he makes even a stronger claim. His claim is that based on current biology, you can take any concept in biology that is reminiscent of downward causation and actually turn it into an explanation based on current biological theory that gets rid of the downward causation. And he even tries to do that. Not many philosophers of biology and biologists think that he's successful, but there is a claim, strong claim of that sort as well. Why is that important? Well, it's important because reductionists would say that you can actually, that biological theory can provide some insight into the structure of nature as long as biological theory confirms to these metaphysical principles I outlined at the beginning. So only then we can really talk about the evidence in this stronger sense, where it is evidence for particular theoretical claims about the biological systems and the world. Now the problem is that in biology, in contemporary biology, it's very hard to find an explanation that fits these reductionist criteria. Actually, most of the explanations appeal to both downward and upward causation. There's kind of a causal reciprocity all over the place. Now, I will just give you an idea of maybe 4 different groups of explanation or theories, to put it that way, in biology that illustrate this. I mean, and there are some, obvious problems that, or questions that this raises are, how do we draw the distinction that really can be inferred from biological explanations with respect to these levels? What exactly, where is the boundary of the organism, where is the boundary of the molecule? What kind of molecule, what kind of molecular aggregate, and so on. The first example, kinds of explanations, is something that John Dupré from the University of Exeter has extensively written about. It's very interesting work, and it concerns the microbiological research of the last maybe few decades, last 10 years, where biologists introduced the idea of the superorganism. Especially, this might seem something as a kind of very exotic example, but actually it's not. Because 80% of all the biomass that has ever existed in nature are bacteria. And especially these bacteria called archaea, very specific kinds of bacteria, they also constitute a great deal of that 80%. So now, in these systems, you can't really talk about a single organism based, for example, on the criterion of a gene that distinguishes individual from other individuals, because these organisms share and exchange laterally all the time genetic material. Not only that, they share metabolism. So really, if you want to find out something about an individual, you really need to look at the entire organism. And you need to look at different levels of the organism. There are other examples of this sort, but the main point is that the analysis and the sort of explanations concerning these systems are such that you really need to treat the level of the entire organism as well as these individual, in some sense, organisms as causally sort of powerful and as having some causal potential to change either the whole or the units. And the entire analysis is predicated actually on that view. Then also in the analysis of circadian cycles, these are the cycles, 24-hour cycles that organisms undergo when that make them sleep so they wake up. Research of these cycles is also treats, for example, cells both as kind of a locus of complex biochemical processes, but also as a factor in these processes. And again, you can't really distinguish which of the levels is basic in a causal sense. Also in the study of plants, for example, whether when the plant grows, the tree trunk, for example, grows, whether the compartments that constitute the tree, the inside of the tree, are they simply compartments which are sort of holes in the protoplasm that sort of grows, or this protoplasm, or they constitute actually the protoplasm. Now, the way that, again, I'm not going to go into the details of the example, but just to give you an idea how that works. Again, causally speaking, you need, if you want to infer any causal sort of map, you're going to need to treat both these compartments and the whole as causally so powerful. Now that goes also, I mean, typically a reductionist response to this, well, but it's all molecules, right? And it's, interactions between molecules. Well, the problem is that the more sort of you go to the micro level, the more obvious this becomes, actually. So, for example, with the genes, this is actually an old discovery by Jacob and Monod that changed the perception, actually, of the function of the DNA greatly. So the first idea was you have DNA, then it has some kind of information that transfers or translates to the proteins, and then you have, cells, organs formed based on that program. Now it turns out that that's not quite how it works. Proteins play this regulatory role. So there's a kind of a loop or a feedback between the regulation provided by or the information provided by the DNA and then the proteins that also regulate in a fairly complex process the way that the DNA will be expressed. So again, the question is really what's the basic unit of this process? It's very hard to tell because you have to include proteins, and if you include proteins, then you have to talk about the parts of the organism really as doing the causal work as well. This is something I worked on. It's the interaction between the DNA and the chromatin. Chromatin was perceived for a long time as simply a kind of scaffolding on which DNA hangs, and the DNA then does its sort of expression work and sort of controls the development of the organism. It turns out that's not how it works, really. For example, just to give you a brief idea, it really depends how the chromatin, it's kind of sort of a spring, physical, a little spring, and can be even explained in that way using the sort of physics of the spring. It really depends how it folds. In order to, it determines how it folds, whether it's folded, whether it's extended, how the DNA will actually get expressed. So the idea is that you have this causal reciprocity all the way through, basically, to the molecular and at the molecular level. Okay. Now, for example, the basic theoretical posit of modern biology, namely the gene, also coding of the gene is not uniquely defined, and it really depends on the aims how you're gonna of your research, how you're gonna explain it or treat it. So several philosophers took this, maybe not these particular examples, but I mean since the 70s actually, Kaufman stated the organisms are entities that can be divided meaningfully in infinitely many ways, and in a way priorities are determined by sort of very narrow theoretical goals. William Winzak made a similar point more recently, Potočnik, that really the supervenience model of properties really is completely useless actually if you want to understand what's going on in biological explanations. Not only that, but the explanatory power of explanations in biology really depends on this reciprocity in causal flow, so to speak. Now, given all this, the question is what philosophers can actually infer from all this. The question is, when do we say that we have evidence for a particular theoretical claim or for coherent theoretical account of what life is, or different domains of life? In other words, when can we say, okay, these experimental results are the evidence for, you know, X, Y, Z, and then we make theoretical claims? Given that coherence, if we understand it in terms of those three reduction principles, are really at odds with biological explanations. Now, one possible attitude, and it seems to be dominating actually these days among philosophers of biology, is instrumentalism. For example, Ken Waters states his basic idea is, look, biology is not really into explaining the world. He's not really into telling us how, what is the structure of nature. It really concerns successful manipulations of organisms. And kind of like having a, you know, biology is really a set of guidelines or sort of a user manual how to manipulate different, very, very precise and very, very comprehensive user manual, but really nothing more than that. There's no sort of coherent high-level theory, nor is that, they're just a kind of a secondary goal of biology. Never really was achieved, by the way. That's his view, just a few quotes. He says it's not the fundamental theory of molecular biology, if indeed such a theory exists, that revolutionized genetics and transformed biological sciences. What changed biology so dramatically was retooling of the investigative strategies used in genetics. And genes are used as levers to manipulate and investigate a wide variety of biological processes. And not much more than that. Okay, so similar argument. So this is what actually biologists did. Now, sometimes they pronounce big goals, kind of that philosophers get excited about, metaphysical goals. You know, we're going to reduce the structure of a living cell to, you know, laws of chemistry, you know, all that. I mean, pronouncements like that. But biology is not really about that. That's what Waters, and not only him, so claims. So, for example, the Jacob and Monod, their work from the 70s, that I meant 60s, 70s, the short-term aim of Jacob and Monod was not to reduce genetics to physics and chemistry, although they said that was their goal. It was to determine the principle governing the causal interactions of the entities responsible for enzyme induction and repression, for phage synthesis and latency. To give just a bunch of rules how successfully to manipulate actually the enzymes and their interaction with proteins and DNA. So these are really pragmatic rules of manipulation with enzymes, and there's no coherent high-level theory to speak of. And more than that, experimental work really is not intended to provide evidence for such grand theoretical claims, or even more modest claims. Carl Kramer made fairly recently a similar argument as well, that really in general relationship of manipulability or sort of manipulability-based explanations should replace, among philosophers and their analysis of science, constitutive explanations which deal with this ontological structure and, you know, all these causal processes in causal terms and try to determine what's coherent, what's not, simply because really biology is not about that. Now, my view is that this is actually a hasty conclusion. It is true that much of biology, as any other science, concerns the sort of manipulability and manipulation of organisms, but it is not the case. How much?
5 minutes on the original scale, but you can.
Okay. I need a little bit more.
Yeah.
So it's true that that's part of what scientists do, but the question is whether there are, or it seems to me that you can be a pessimist about the inferences from biological manipulations in terms of the coherent theory, and then sort of using these experimental results to say, well, this is the evidence for particular theoretical claims. If you subscribe to these coherence criteria provided by the reductionists, those three principles, or a version of that. And that's really what reductionists and instrumentalists in a way share, because instrumentalists also think that we do not have coherent theoretical generalizations in biology, and they, on that account, they actually agree with the reductionists, because they would say, the reductionist criteria really are the criteria of what it means to have a coherent theory, but they just differ in terms of the conclusion, because reductionists would insist, oh well, in principle every scientific theory has to conform to these criteria, whereas instrumentalists would say, well, that's not, it's kind of tangential issue to what science really is all about, at least biology is all about. It's concerned with manipulating organisms and not with providing coherent accounts of nature. Now, it seems to me that really you have to question these criteria of coherence. In other words, one could try and reformulate the concept of entities and the concept of causation that is implicit, or actually explicit, in the reductionist metaphysics that I started with. And only then you can actually question this view that biological manipulations are not really evidence for any higher level theoretical claims. Now, it's easy to say that, but this is what I just told you. And I mean, in terms of the kind of analysis that leads to this attitude, it's really the kind of very narrow a priori analysis in rational metaphysics of the kind that Jagon Kim actually does, that provides these criteria. And that's what I find really sort of unsatisfying or worrying, because philosophers of biology, instrumentalists and reductionists alike, subscribe basically to the criteria of what's supposed to be a coherent ontological model, which is done in sort of a priori analysis based on very narrow assumptions about what entities could be and what causal interactions between entities could be. So that's really methodologically speaking where the problem is coming from, it seems to me. So how do you cure all that? Well, the first question is that, instrumentalists or reductionists would pose, well, you have all these manipulations, all these kind of guidelines how to manipulate organisms, then what is that supposed to be evidence for? In other words, what are the concepts that you're introducing as an alternative to, or what, to that sort of fixed causal hierarchy? I mean, are you saying that downward causation exists? Well, that's incoherent and so on and so on. That's really the literature debate between reductionists and emergentists, which is kind of going nowhere as far as I can see. Now, again, the methodological problem here is that you cannot really do or resolve debate of that sort purely by kind of a priori philosophizing. I mean, you can say something insightful, perhaps, but when you try to conceptualize something based on actual insights from science, in this case biology, then you have to use, or it's prudent to use a much wider resource, so to speak, maybe even from history of philosophy, in order to understand or to kind of derive coherent ontological models from these explanations. Now, this is a project of its own, right? I just want to point out the problem. How do we do that? And how do we conceptualize, entities that square with the kinds of explanations we have in biology? But just a few sort of hints how that might work. So, for example, how do we establish a criterion of individuation, for example, of an entity? I mean, the main problem is that in biology we find two kinds of entities. We find sort of homogeneous entities. So an entity that's complex, homogeneous entity, that's composed of pretty much similar or same kinds of units, a molecule, for example, although that's not always true. And then we find organized wholes, which are very structured, have very heterogeneous parts, but they still function as a unit. Now, what's really the challenge there is to explain how these two kinds of entities interact. Now, you can't really sort of cut the corners, ontologically speaking, there, and try to, pursue some kind of crude reductionist account, because, I mean, you can, but that will never really be accurate with biological systems that you're looking at. On the other hand, you have to explain, what constitutes the sort of coherence, understanding, basic understanding of the interaction of these two kinds of entities. What are the criteria of individuality, individuation there? Just mention a few more. I mean, there are attempts of this sort. John Dupre, for example, he advocates kind of resurrect the process ontology, for example. I don't think that's actually satisfying, because he tries to eliminate entities from his ontology entirely, which again doesn't really match what we have in biology, because in biology we talk about processes and entities in a very particular sense as well. This is pretty much what I told you. I mean, I have an example, but with that, I mean, understanding, for example, a metabolism as a system, again, sometimes you have to understand it as a sort of a coherent, as a internally bound or causally bound whole, very organized and fixed in a way, and then you have to explain how it interacts with something like molecule, which is very homogeneous compared to the heterogeneous entity of that sort. And how do you treat it really? Does that become sort of automatically another basic part of the entire metabolism, or what is the what kind of interaction, causal interaction we have there? I'm not going to try to address here maybe the question period, but one of the conceptual changes I think that has to occur is that we really abandon the notion of causal powers, because the idea of causal powers, or reformulate, do something with them. Really, the causal powers, as realized in the entities, are pushing us in that sort of reductionist kind of explanations. There are other ideas of, concerning causation. I mean, throughout history of philosophy, actually, I think are very coherent, can be applied here successfully. And in a way, biological explanations are much more suggestive of these other sorts of explanations. Some structural idea of a structural cause, which is much more similar to Aristotelian, material cause, for example, and so on. Okay, so that's another hint. Now, in general, so this last point is that really we are using, or philosophers who do the a priori analyses very often use inadequate models. It's always billiard balls or a car, that sort of has its own parts, and then, it's a collection, car is merely a collection of its parts and so on. Really, we can use other analogies, which are very different from this, and will push us in different directions, conceptualize actually ontological models in a very different way. For example, the models from, or analogies from chemistry, and reactions, the idea of reactions in chemistry, or for example, the idea of concept of systems in computer science. You get a very different sort of way in which whatever you want to, in which entities are stratified and interconnected. And it doesn't look problematic. That's really sort of the point. So, in that sense, the sort of reductionism, anti-reductionism sort of dilemma again becomes kind of orthogonal to that account. But we can still say, well, look, these are the concepts that are based on our insights, on the empirical insights, and it's just that they tell us that the nature is more complicated, very different than. And that we can have a sort of coherent, or at least bits and pieces of coherent theoretical accounts, very different from what those reductionist criteria of coherence suggest. So I think that would be it. Thanks.